and professionals in transplantation medicine, published by international law firm Global Rights Compliance, GRC. My name is Nina and I'm the Administration Manager for the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, or ETAC. I've been communicating with some of you over the past couple of years regarding various advocacy initiatives, and some of you just only over the past couple of months for today's event. I'd like to thank you all for engaging with this issue, and I look forward to keeping in touch following this briefing. And thanks also for accommodating the date change. There are some NGOs who couldn't make it today due to the date change. However, the presentation component of today's meeting will be recorded, but not the Q&A. But please be assured that only the presenter will be visible in the recording, but just wanted to make you aware that it will be recorded today. We won't make the recording public, but it will be available to those who missed today's briefing and on request for any NGOs that we link up with that might be interested to watch the briefing. Please feel free to enable or disable your camera if you wish, but if I can just ask that mics remain muted throughout the presentation. We've allowed an hour for today's presentation, and I do know that Wayne does have a hard finish at 11 a.m. 11 p.m. Australian time where I am, but it'll be a different time for all of you. But if there remain pressing questions, Ali and I can stay on for a few more minutes to try and respond to those, and any that we're unable to, we'll be able to get back to you by email. Speaking of Ali, I'd like to introduce Ali, who's the Legal and Communications Officer with ETAC and joins us from Europe today. Ali will facilitate the Q&A following the presentation. Hello, Ali.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's great to have you here. If you have questions during Wayne's talk, please just put them in the chat or during the Q&A, and if possible, write in capital so I know it's a question. I'm sure there'll be some comments coming through as well. But yeah, thanks, Nina.
Lovely. And now I'd like to introduce Wayne Jordash, KC, Managing Partner at GRC, who'll be presenting the briefing today. Wayne is a world-leading lawyer specialising in international human rights and humanitarian law. Wayne provides advice to governments, international organisations, corporations and communities on how to comply with IHRL and IHL, manage human rights risks, and how to seek redress in the international human rights and criminal law system. He's an internationally recognised expert in the global network of international tribunals, including at the ICC and the ICJ in relation to allegations of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. Welcome and thank you very much for being here today, Wayne. I'll now hand over to you for the presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nina. And thank you, everyone who is attending this session for taking the time. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. I'm going to speak for probably about 20-25 minutes and talk you through the legal advisory and the policy guidance that we at GRC compiled and issued, and talk about not just what they contain, but the motivation behind their compilation, and why we think they are important in terms of trying to bring about more responsible behavior in the transplant industry. Now, both of these documents are the result of approximately 6 months of work involving an extensive literature review, but also a range of interviews with practicing transplantation medical professionals, including surgeons, anaesthetists, bioethicists, as well as medical journal editors and other experts in the field. The need for the advisory and the policy guidance themselves arose out of real concern, which is evident in the open source research, which illustrates that in a number of countries and in medical institutions, hospitals and centers and so on within the transplant medicine industry, and also more generally in the pharmaceutical and medical technology industry, it's crystal clear that many of the partnerships that these industries involved involve high-risk activity and the real risk of contributing to grave human rights abuses. And more than that, what the open source material revealed, and also what our research confirmed, was that despite obvious risks, little or no due diligence is being carried out to assess the impacts of these partnerships or the impacts of activities within these industries on human rights. And very little is being done to remediate the impacts when there is evidence that activities or partnerships are potentially contributing to human rights violations. So this was an attempt by us to have a look at the transplant industry and make recommendations as to what could be done, or what should be done rather, according to international law, to strengthen responsible conduct and to ensure that activities and partnerships remained on the right side of the law. So the first document, as you'll appreciate, the advisory, looks essentially at the international legal risks and human rights responsibilities of institutions and transplant-associated entities within the industry, as well as the professionals that work in these institutions and their obligations to prevent human rights violations. So this, of course, as you'll appreciate, includes hospitals, medical schools, professional, medical and transplantation societies, funding bodies, as well as medical journals. What we hope is that, and I'll come to some of the content in a moment, but what we hope is that these documents essentially raise public awareness amongst the medical sector, as well as amongst policy makers, parliamentarians, think tanks, international organizations, but also, and this is critical, raise awareness in relation to NGOs, international NGOs working on human rights, and provides a clear path to international NGOs in terms of the obligations and the means of meeting those obligations in terms of respecting human rights. And in that sense, are a departure point for NGOs who are able to use these documents in various ways to advocate for change and to lobby within the industry and lobby outside of the industry in order to bring about more responsible conduct. So to summarize, this is what we found. First of all, we looked at the nature of the risks within the industry. The advisory, as you'll see, elaborates on some of these risks. And what we wanted to do was not just focus on the obvious risk, which I'll come to in a moment, that is forced organ harvesting, which is government sponsored, as in the Chinese situation. But we also wanted to look at the whole continuum of risk from what is and should be called transplant tourism. Transplant tourism, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a black market for organs where people pay for organs, essentially wealthy countries using poor countries to obtain transplants. That's one side of the risks we looked at. Moving to organized crime, and then moving to the sharp end to a system of forced organ harvesting in China. And the problem is immense. Even at what I'll call the softer end, the transplant tourism, we're talking about a huge industry. 10% of the world's transplants, very lucrative, with an annual revenue ranging between $840 million US to $1.7 billion US. Transplant tourism, perhaps I shouldn't use the term the softer end, because it's crystal clear that it involves a trampling of key principles that ought to be inherent or an integral part of organ donation, and that is voluntary and informed consent. The World Health Organization is clear that in order for organ donation to be ethical, the donor must, quote, act willingly and free of any undue influence or coercion, close quotes. So that is one side of the sliding scale, a huge industry, all the way to, as I've mentioned, state-sanctioned regimes such as the People's Republic of China, where organs are forcibly removed from executed prisoners and prisoners of conscience. Now, in this sharper end, the most serious type of human rights abuse, what we're talking about is essentially, and this is quite stark when you break it down, in fact, in some ways, the terminology masks the brutality that's involved in this activity. It's the killing of a person so that their organs may be removed without their free, voluntary, and informed consent, so that it can be transplanted into another person. Now, how do we know that this is a high risk in China? Well, since the early 2000s, there's been concerns about such a system in China. Some of you may be familiar with that information and with that evidence, but it's worth just quickly looking at it again. At the beginning of the 2000s, China leapt from being a follower to a leader of transplantation technology. Despite there being no voluntary donation system, within 4 years, the country made impressive developments in the field of transplantation, with organ transplantation hospital numbers tripling and transplantation surgery expanding from kidney transplants to hearts, lungs, and livers. Interestingly, and I think significantly, transplant tourists were able to obtain matched organs within a few weeks or months, compared, as you'll appreciate, to countries with well-established donation systems where you could be waiting for years for such a match. Moreover, the transplants in China were able to be planned in advance with specific dates on organ availability provided to the recipient of the organ well ahead of time. It's obvious, isn't it, when you have that kind of efficiency, let's say, that something is seriously amiss. In 2009, the PRC officially stated, and they admitted, that 2/3 of all organs used in transplantations were removed from death row prisoners, asserting that the prisoners had consented. Again, there's something obvious about that excuse. The idea of death row prisoners consenting to their organs being used in transplantations, and that consent was informed and voluntary, does really seem to stretch the bounds of credulity. So moving to present day, it's really important to note that despite China making this so-called admission, there's still many anomalies which can't be accounted for. Research has indicated that organ sources from China have to include non-death row prisoners, including Falun Gong practitioners, as the execution of death penalty sentences have declined since 2000, while the transplantation system continues to grow. Crucially, the timeframes of the growth of that system also match the crackdown of the PRC's government on the Falun Gong practitioners. For those of you not familiar with Falun Gong, it's a spiritual practice rooted in traditional Buddhist and Daoist teachings. Prior to the large-scale campaigns aimed at eradicating Falun Gong, which included disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and other grave human rights violations, the movement had been very popular in China, including amongst state authorities. However, after the crackdown began, essentially as I noted, the availability of organs appeared to increase, and the transplant industry in China expanded. Research has shown that the numbers of organ transplant surgeries still substantially exceeds the numbers of registered organ donors. Moreover, there's more direct evidence of these crimes. The China Tribunal, which was a people's tribunal held by Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, in London, and a panel of 7 experts. This was essentially an adjudicative mechanism which called evidence from Falun Gong practitioners, which called evidence from fact witnesses, which called evidence from experts within the transplant industry, and civil society activists, and found, in summary, that there was evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Falun Gong practitioners had served as the primary source of organs for forced organ harvesting in China, and that this amounted to a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, and it constituted crimes against humanity. As you'll see in the advisory, we also talk further about the corroboration of this finding by UN special rapporteurs and 4 UN human rights experts in June of last year, and the Uyghur Tribunal as well, which was a similar tribunal to the China Tribunal, but looking more specifically at Uyghurs, again finding credible evidence of forcible harvesting in China. And so what we know is that there is plenty of evidence to support the idea of a forced regime in China. What we know is that even putting that aside, there is ample evidence of other types of abuses in this industry, notwithstanding, as we discuss in the advisory, and what we discovered in the research, is that the degree of complacency within the industry is surprising, if not shocking. Many professionals seem to think that because the abuses cannot always be nailed down, or because you rely upon inferences, however obvious those inferences may be, in short, that there may not be a smoking gun on a particular issue or event or incident, no action is required. Well, that is not, as you'll appreciate as human rights activists, a healthy starting point when dealing with human rights obligations, nor is it a useful starting point if you're an industry trying to protect either your reputation or avoid criminal liability. We give examples of how these risks are being disregarded in the industry in the advisory. For example, international transplantation societies such as the Global Transplantation Society and their national counterparts, they regularly interact with Chinese transplantation professionals as part of annual academic conferences and professional development programs, as well as universities and medical schools. And yet it's hard to find concrete examples of risk avoidance or due diligence or remediation when links to human rights abuses are discovered. Pharmaceutical companies enter into joint ventures with Chinese companies to carry out research and trials into new immunosuppressive drugs, and are granted exclusive distribution licenses in the PRC. Several studies carried out by bioethicists and other researchers have shown that well-known medical journals have published numerous research articles by Chinese medical professionals where it could not be ascertained that the donor had consented to having their organs removed or used for research purposes. Instead, the research articles raise significant concerns that the organs must have been or may have been unethically or forcibly removed. The fact that all these journal articles were published illustrates the point that I'm trying to make, which is that there is little or no due diligence in relation to these risks. And again, what we're talking about is risks at the sharper end of the scale. And these risks are, of course, they're reputational, but they're also legal, and we look at those in the advisory. Those of you with extensive knowledge on corporate liability will understand the potential for risks of complicities in crimes, and in relation to China, crimes against humanity. You'll appreciate that depending on the type of partnership and the potential proximity to the violation, such as forced organ harvesting, will determine the type of legal risk that is present. And so when we look at the advisory, we look at these risks, we look at what complicity means in relation to international crimes, and we highlight the responsibilities to avoid these risks, and essentially the responsibility to respect human rights. And that responsibility is not just about states. The state's responsibility is more stringent, but business, i.e. those within the transplant industries, and we're not talking about just profit industries, we're talking about industry such as the transplant industry, such as the health industry, such as medical industry, such as surgeons, etc. These are businesses for these purposes. And we look at what, as a matter of international law, businesses such as these have to do in order to respect human rights and thereby stay on the right side of international law. I won't go into each and every step that needs to be taken. It's there in the advisory, but what we're talking about is three essential things. One is to develop a human rights policy. Two is to develop, implement and evaluate minimum human rights due diligence processes. And three is essentially remedy, how to, or the obligation to provide a remedy, and that includes an obligation to disengage from a particular partnership or activity when remediation of risk and harm is not possible. You will appreciate that what I've just talked about are not single actions. These are processes which all industry, whether you're Nike or whether you're a hospital dealing in transplant surgery, have to engage with if those risks are to be managed properly, and if those industries are to essentially respect human rights. And so coming to a close of this part of the presentation, I want to sort of just pause and look at the recent developments since we published the legal advisory and the policy guidance. And I ought to have said the policy guidance is a follow-on from the advisory in the sense that what it tries to do is provide concrete answers, or rather concrete illustrations of how of actions that businesses, that transplant businesses should take in order to meet their obligations vis-a-vis the UN guiding principles and the policy statement, the due diligence and remedies. It does provide valuable assistance in terms of taking practical steps to meet these obligations. Since we published both the advisory and the policy, the guidance, there's been a number of developments in response to forced organ harvesting as crimes against humanity in China, both in the political spheres as well as by medical stakeholders, due in large part to the continuous effort of non-profit organizations, NGOs, activists, who have worked tirelessly and used the attention on China and lobbied to be able to turn that attention into concrete action to protect human rights. So at the beginning of May, the EU Parliament adopted a resolution on the continued reports of forced organ harvesting in China, in which it acknowledged that forced organ harvesting in China may amount to crimes against humanity, and called on, quote, relevant institutions in the member states to evaluate and revisit the terms of their collaborations with Chinese institutions on transplant medicine research and training. In addition, the UK passed the Health and Care Act, which amends the Human Tissue Act of 2004 and adds extraterritorial offences under Section 32A for commercial dealings in organs carried out in China or other countries. This includes the purchase and sale of organs and any conduct related to the participation in organ trafficking. It is a great piece of legislation. Of course, we have to see how it works in practice, but it's very wide-ranging. It has an expansive reach. It covers a wide range of activity, including giving or receiving rewards for supply, or even rewards for the putting up rewards for the offer of organs. It covers initiating or negotiating for reward for the supply of organs, and even covers advertising for such arrangements. So it is, I won't use the term a model piece of legislation, but it is much better than most which have been brought in nationally or internationally over the last decades. But nonetheless, there's a long way to go in the industry. There's a long way to go in terms of national legislations to regulate the industry, and there's a long way to go in terms of, as I mentioned when I first started this presentation, there's a long way to go for the industry itself to regulate its own activities. Leading bodies and organizations in transplantation medicine, such as the Global Transplantation Society or the UK Royal Colleges of Physicians or Surgeons, have not really been seen to respond to any calls to be taken in relation to clear human rights stances in relation to obvious violations. There does seem to be an unhealthy culture of accepting that no actions or little needs to be done. Again, this is not matched by the evidence of risk within the industry. We've met, as I've mentioned, with a number of medical stakeholders to talk about these issues and the need for human rights due diligence. And that's the core of these obligations, the human rights due diligence, and the need for that to be implemented across the industry. To be honest, the response is not terribly edifying. As I say, many within the industry look for a smoking gun, and many simply turn a blind eye. It is prevalent across the entire medical industry. Again, I mentioned some of the changes, so it's not to say there's no movement at all, but it is to say there is a lot of room for more movement. Most recently, the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation updated its statement on transplant ethics and reinstated a full academic boycott of the Society on transplant-related research from China. This boycott encompasses any research or data submitted for presentation at meetings sponsored by the Society, to the Thoracic Registry, or for publication in any of their journals, including the Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation. Such developments are significant, and it seems to foreshadow a change within the industry, a small one, but nonetheless a definite one, and an acceptance that surgeons in certain fields of transplantation are in agreement that the risks are too high to allow for business to continue as usual and for continued involvement in these relationships with China. Other medical stakeholders also appear to be waking up to these risks. The British Medical Association, we co-hosted a launch event with them back in April. They are unequivocally calling for the medical sector to take organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting seriously. The Canadian Medical Association also, who we had a collaboration with in relation to a panel we did with them, have issued a public statement in response to the concerns and clarified its support for the Canadian bill that will introduce criminal offences in relation to certain activities related to the trafficking of human organs without the informed consent of a donor. And so, just to finish and then open the discussion up, it's a moment, I think, of real change or potential for change. Maybe that's the better way to put it within the transplant industry. Excuse me. I think it's a real moment where human rights activists and NGOs, if working together, if pushing in the right direction, can really make a difference. I think the medical industry, as we've discovered, is at least listening and ready perhaps to take action. And I think the time is certainly now, certainly more than it was over the last few years. And so I look forward to hearing your views and hopefully continuing the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That was a really brilliant talk. Interesting to hear about the complacency of medical professionals given the nature of their profession. Again, we're so pleased to have this outstanding framework for organisations and professionals to work with when they have any interactions with China. So thank you very much for your tremendous work over the last year or so. We're going to go to Q&A now for the rest of the session. Please, everyone feel free to ask about the advisory, but also about forced organ harvesting in general, because perhaps many of you won't have heard about it or don't know much about it. So please ask anything that will enable you to help us, and we're very grateful for your support. So we have the first question from Justice for All. What ways have you seen people or organisations using this report in different arenas so far?
Well, I have to say it's early days, and we haven't so far conducted any